To paraphrase the great Reykjavik, this video took 2 months longer than it should have to make. How do you even begin to summarize a year in gaming like 2017? It seemed as if though a new must-play game was coming out pretty much every other week. This was a year where we were not only spoiled for choice, there were simply not enough hours per day to play everything. I made a concerted effort to try to keep up with the new releases as best I could, trying to play at least one new major game every month. Come fall, I was completely wiped out. Not only were there a boatload of good games this year, many of them were good, long games. Some of them were open world games with tons of things to do, some of them were RPGs with really long campaigns and tons of dialogue, and some were just games that took a really long time to beat due to their inherent design. Putting together a top 10 for this year has been difficult. Since I skipped doing a full video last year, I planned on really going for it this time. I wanted to cover as many games as I could, within reason of course, and I kept my year-end list in mind throughout all of it. When I had played as many games as I could manage, I could not for the life of me find a way to get them into a list that I was happy with. There always seemed to be at least one really amazing game that I had to leave out. I changed it time and time again, but no matter what I did, I kept finding myself in the same scenario. I think what I have now is the closest I can get to a definitive list, or as definitive as you can get in a year like this. The only criteria for a game to get on the list is how much I enjoyed my time with it. Before we get to that though, I'd like to mention a few games that will not be featured on this list for one reason or another. Anything on the Switch, as I've yet to pick one up, Cuphead, which I just haven't gotten around to yet, Divinity Original Sin 2, because there really hasn't been time, Night in the Woods, which I also never got around to, Destiny 2 due to its questionable interactions with its player base, and finally, PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds, a game that simply does not appeal to me. I know it's the hottest thing of last year and it has a massive player base and all that, but I simply cannot drum up any interest in it. Different strokes and all that. Anyway, with that house cleaning out of the way, I now present to you Opie Does Story's Top 10 Games of 2017. Number 10. Sonic Mania. While it wasn't the first game I ever played, the first game I remember playing and being really impressed by was Sonic the Hedgehog 2. Since then, I've had a soft spot for Sonic games, particularly the 16-bit ones. I more or less fell off the series entirely after Sonic Adventure 2, only making a brief stop for Generations. Other than that, I've stayed away, as the series just stopped appealing to me. So color me surprised that they not only greenlit a new 2D game in the classic style, but that said 2D game turned out to be one of the best ones there's ever been. While this game borrows heavily from previous games, there is enough new here to utterly delight me as an old-school Sonic player. As Johnny said in his review of the game, it's shameless nostalgia pandering, but when it's executed this well, I don't really mind. Plus, it's a really solid game in its own right, so in this case I don't really think the reliance on nostalgia is a hindrance. In fact, I would say that my warm memories for these games are what made this so special to me. I remember when I got to Chemical Plant Zone, the second level of both this game and Sonic 2, and I just got this tingling feeling of excitement in my stomach, that feeling you got as a kid when you were really pumped to get going with a new level. It's been a long time since I felt anything like that, and to feel it now as an adult was something really special. At the same time, there was a twang of familiarity when playing through the reused levels, making me remember why I fell in love with these games to begin with. As I was going through the flying battery stage, I got through the first part on mostly memory and routine alone, which really gave me a comforting feeling, a strange sense of coming home. The remixes of the old zones also keeps things fresh enough for the game to stay interesting, and the new stages are probably the best ones in the entire game. That also applies to the music. The remixes of the old themes are spot on, and the new stuff is even better. It slots in perfectly with the old tunes, but also sounds new and refreshing at the same time. There are a few hiccups that prevent this from reaching beyond number 10, however. Many zones are way bigger than those of the older games, yet they've kept the arbitrary 10-minute time limit, which just feels dated and something that was left in out of obligation rather than necessity. This also ties in with most stages being full of secrets, so you can't really go exploring. At least not if you don't want to lose a life to the aforementioned time limit. I also find some of the levels to be a little over-designed and samey. Getting spun through a loop and into a tube in Hydro City zone isn't that exciting to begin with, and it did not need to happen like 20 times in one act. Even so, these issues are not substantial enough to detract from the overall experience, and for every one thing that I'm not completely on board with, there are 10 great ones to make up for it. As I said, I'm fully aware that this game is pandering to people like me who grew up with the older games, yet there is no way I can't take my memories into account when evaluating my time with Sonic Mania, seeing as it was a major contributing factor as to how much I enjoyed it. As to how a newcomer would experience it, I really have no idea, but I reckon they would probably have a good time with it as well, seeing as it's just a really solid 2D platformer. Whether you're a returning fan or a first-time Sonic player, I'm convinced there's something here for everyone. Number 9. Uncharted: The Lost Legacy. Back in early 2010, Uncharted 2 was the game that finally convinced me to get myself a PS3. I played it and enjoyed it, but the first time I actually went back to the series was in 2016 with Uncharted 4. That game was a mixed bag for me. I greatly enjoyed the story and the writing, hopping around ruins and climbing is always fun, and the game was just gorgeous from beginning to end. Whenever it was time for a combat sequence, however, my interest plummeted. The combat wasn't interesting enough to warrant the amount of it that there was, and there are only so many times I can stand having what I'm doing be interrupted by a bunch of soldiers who pop up in front of you like a tedious hurdle. What I really want to do in these games is to explore interesting locations and partake in those over-the-top set-piece stages that just dazzle you with their production values and choreography, not spend the majority of my time playing a by-the-numbers cover shooter. Then came The Lost Legacy, which was seemingly designed to address all the grievances I had with 4. Firstly, it stars Chloe Frazier as the main playable character, a very welcome change after 4 full games with Nathan Drake. Secondly, it's shorter, leading to a more focused and less padded experience. Thirdly, combat sections are few and usually pretty far between, especially since you spend the majority of the game ahead of your rivals for once. And fourthly, the main focus this time is on exploration and puzzle solving. In other words, everything I like about the series has been brought to the forefront, with combat as a secondary priority, making this my favorite Uncharted game to date. Add to all this that the game takes place in an amazingly beautiful location, packed with fascinating structures and entire cities that feel almost supernatural and yet somehow believable. It's just a joy to run around and see what details you can uncover, further helped by the series' signature banter and comments from the 2 main characters. On that note, I really like what they did with Nadine in this game. In 4, she was basically the muscle for the main antagonist, with some, but ultimately limited character development. Here you get a clear idea of who she is and what she's all about, and I really like how she plays off Chloe, who is as fun and charming as ever. She too gets some additional development, which is always welcome. There are also some other characters involved who I was happy to see, but I'll leave it at that to avoid spoilers. I would also say that the main villain is a step up compared to earlier games, though it's still a warlordish type of dude with a private army/militia. This has basically been the Uncharted villain MO since day one, but I still think he made for a good antagonist. Speaking of the formula, the trademark set pieces are of course here as well. There are not that many of them, seeing as the game is quite short, but they still make do with what they have. They even try their hand at a train sequence similar to the one in Uncharted 2, but they still manage to put their own spin on it, and it really does feel like its own beast. As always, these set pieces are both spectacular to look at and fun to play through, and while they've become a bit of a trope at this point, I for one can't get enough of them. All in all, this was a great experience from beginning to end, and I think that has a lot to do with it being shorter than previous entries. Nothing really has time to drag or become redundant, and it uses the time it has very effectively to deliver a fantastic, proper adventure. Like I said earlier, it's my favorite game in the series so far, and it has me genuinely curious to see where they'll steer this franchise next. Number 8. Nioh. With no new Souls game coming out in 2017, it was only logical that other studios would take a stab at From Software's niche RPG formula. Enter Nioh. Nioh's nickname Samurai Souls proved to be quite appropriate, seeing as the core gameplay is very heavily inspired by the Souls games, but not without some twists and variations. The combat is very fast-paced and reminds me a lot of Bloodborne, but with an even heavier focus on finesse and timing. The level selection is similar to that of Demon Souls, in that you basically pick a self-contained stage and then go through it. Unlike the ones in Demon Souls, however, these levels are way more densely packed, with a progression system similar to the bonfires in Dark Souls. Like the games that inspired it, Nioh is all about getting through extremely challenging gauntlets before fighting an even more challenging boss. That is, however, where the similarities end and Nioh becomes its own beast. The key words to the Nioh experience are choice and depth. Regardless of how you prefer to play an action RPG, you are more or less guaranteed to find something here that suits you. If you don't include the DLC, there are 5 different weapon types, all with their own combos, speeds and damage outputs. Each weapon also has 3 stances, which drastically changes how they handle. In addition to that, you also have ranged weapons, ninjutsu, magic spells, accessories and guardian spirits to further help you customize your playstyle. This was all something I truly appreciated. Finding the playstyle that suits you the best and then gradually mastering it was a wonderful feeling. Here's where that second keyword I mentioned comes in, depth. If you really want to dig into it, all the previously mentioned systems can be explored and honed to ridiculous levels, and in addition to that, you also have a fully developed crafting system. If the numbers game is your thing, you'll have your work cut out for you. It really has to be said that this game comes dangerously close to being overly bloated with systems, but I would still say that the most important ones are easy enough to understand. Once combat gets going, you'll need all the advantages you can get. This game is ruthless, even more so than the games that inspired it. Mastering the combat takes some time, but once you get the hang of it, it's not only tons of fun, but equal parts rewarding. Granted, there are times where you'll feel like you're not making much progress, but that is kind of par for the course with these kinds of games. With a little patience, and a pillow to punch in frustration, every challenge the game throws your way can be overcome. Something I also thoroughly enjoyed was the setting and the enemy design. You'd be hard-pressed to find a grimmer depiction of Japan than this, as all you'll see is misery and despair, without a single stroke of sugarcoating in sight. That goes double for the enemies, most of which are based on mythological creatures from the region. They're downright grotesque and equally intimidating, something that makes it all the more satisfying to cut them down. There is nothing about this game's setting that I would call pleasant, but it really is the perfect stage for this kind of game. Neo is a fantastic take on the Souls formula, and seeing more developers put their own spin on the concept really makes me excited at the possibilities. With that said though, at this point I really feel like I'm soulsed out. I have all the DLC for this game ready to go, but I've yet to touch it. Not because I didn't enjoy the game, it wouldn't be on this list if I didn't, but because I just need a break from these kinds of games. After all, I've been playing a new one every year since 2014. If there was one game that was to be my temporary send-off from them, however, I'm really glad it was this one. Number 7. Yakuza Zero. When 2017 started, I only knew the Yakuza series by name. After a few months, my brother-in-law began speaking very fondly of Zero, so I checked it out. It looked terrific, but I was far too busy at the time to give it my full attention, but I always kept it at the back of my mind. Come winter, I finally had the time to sit down and play it for myself, and boy oh boy was I in for a treat. If I had to summarize this game, it would be that it is, in every sense of the word, goddamn ridiculous. The story is, in essence, about a real estate dispute, but it's packed to the brim with intrigue, action, memorable characters, and fight scenarios so over the top they make games like Sleeping Dogs look completely reasonable. The fights themselves are firework displays of brutality and style, where you can pull off some of the most ludicrous moves ever witnessed in a video game. You can pick up a dude by the collar and slam him into 3 other dudes before chucking him across the room, or you can use a baseball bat to see what would happen if you treated some unlucky bastard's face as a practice ball. I mean, hell, you can dodge one dude's punch, causing him to hit another guy, then kick the first guy's foot from behind so hard that it punts the other guy in the nuts, after which you knock him out with an elbow to the back of the head. And that's just a few of them. The combat system is really deep and there are dozens if not hundreds of moves to discover. The fights also remain fun and satisfying throughout the whole game, though I will admit I was getting a little tired towards the end, but seeing as this is a pretty long game, it's fairly impressive that it was able to keep it up for as long as it did. As you may be aware, this game also has a sillier side, both in terms of audio and visuals, but also in its writing. One thing I will never understand is how they pull off the contrast between the many serious and heartfelt scenes of the story with some of the most delightfully silly moments I've ever seen. Allow me to illustrate. One moment you could be watching this. And not 5 minutes later, you could be watching this. How they pull that off without giving you a case of severe mood whiplash is beyond me, but somehow they do. When the game wants to be serious, it knows how to do it. And when it wants to be downright hilarious, it knows how to do that too. Another thing this game really nails is the audio. The voice acting is all in Japanese, much to the game's benefit, seeing as a dub would feel extremely out of place. If you're going for a game with a heavy focus on the inner workings of Japanese society, you might as well go all the way. In addition to that, the acting itself is excellent, which really helps sell the whole story. It's not just the voices this game gets right, the role the music plays in setting up the action can't be understated. Ahead of every major fight, it pumps you up to almost stupidly high levels, making the subsequent brawl all the more satisfying. While there are a few hiccups in presentation in general, stiff character models and animations being the main culprits, the audio and fully rendered cutscenes more than make up for them. And holy shit does this game know how to frame a boss fight. There are a bunch of things I could go way more in depth on, like the management minigames, one of which is so good I would play it on its own if I could, to the breadth of content available in terms of side quests, activities, collectibles, and milestones. Granted, not all of them are great. Some of them I would even go as far as to call terrible. The rock, paper, scissors wrestling comes to mind, but if you want to, you can sink dozens upon dozens of hours into this game without ever touching the main story. On the flip side, I feel I have to mention that there are certain issues and topics that this game does not handle all that gracefully, but that's a rabbit hole I won't go down, and it was not to the point that it discouraged me from playing and enjoying the game. These games really are one of a kind, and if what you've seen in the background and heard me say interests you, then I highly recommend you take the plunge on this game and this series. Number 6. What Remains of Edith Finch? I picked this game up on the recommendation Joseph Anderson made in his video discussing the game, and I'm very glad I did. This game belongs to the contentious genre known as walking simulators, one that's been very hit or miss for me personally. I really like Gone Home, but for every one of those, there are a dozen dull or downright pretentious imitators, where the developers seem to think that you can substitute substance and actual storytelling with vagueness, slow piano tracks, and entry-level philosophical ideas. What Remains of Edith Finch is not one of those games. It's beautiful, yet haunting. It's intriguing and inquisitive, but also morose with a dark outlook on life. It has a mellow pace, but it's never boring. It's a gripping tale from beginning to end, and I can now call it my new favorite entry into the genre. You play as Edith Finch, a young woman returning to her childhood home to discover what happened to the members of her family and her older relatives. Her bloodline, the Finches, is said to be cursed, and the curse has claimed every single one of them, going all the way back to the ancestor who migrated from Norway to the US. This means that Edith is now the last surviving member of the family. The game is partially you exploring the house and partially you experiencing the last moments leading up to the deaths of the other Finches in the form of sub-stories. The sub-stories vary in length and style, but pretty much all of them are extremely well told and all have a unique twist to them, both in terms of gameplay and storytelling. Some of them hit me so hard that I actually had to take a break and spend a moment reflecting on what I just experienced, and one or two of them almost brought me to tears. They really are that powerful. Since you know the story about to be told will result in the eventual death of the character, some of them are tough even to start, especially when you already know that some of the Finches didn't make it past their 10th birthday. The one story that's gotten the most attention in the press is the story of Louis, the main character's older brother, and I can't help but echo that sentiment. If you have even a passing interest in this game, the price of admission is worth it for that chapter alone. I have never seen anything like it, and I'm not sure we ever will again. It really is something to behold and listen to, and the finale is one of the most well-executed emotional gut punches you'll ever experience. Aside from that one, the tales of Walter, Gregory and Sam also really stayed with me, both for how they were framed, quite literally for one of them, and the impact they had on me. The game's presentation also deserves a lot of credit. The graphics, while not the most advanced, are very pleasant and very fitting for the game in question. The voice work is overall really solid and paint most of the characters in a tragically sympathetic light, and the music is spot on for every segment. I also want to bring attention to the creative use of subtitles. They're seamlessly woven into the various scenes and really contribute to the atmosphere, and I don't think I've ever seen subtitles integrated into a game's aesthetic in such a manner. It all comes together to create a very elegant experience. Overall, this is a beautiful, tragic, and extremely memorable game. It's a moving exploration on the themes of death, superstition, and the bonds between generations. Out of all the games I played last year, this was the one that truly surprised me with how much of an impression it made on me. Number 5. Nier Automata. Where to even start with this one? This game really is an example of where the final product is greater than the sum of its parts. The combat is good, but not amazing. The open world is pretty dull and empty, but is greatly enhanced by the music and the atmosphere. The story is a bit convoluted and a little melodramatic at times, but it's still good stuff with some interesting characters, twists and developments. Mechanically speaking, Automata is good, or at the very least serviceable, but if those were the only standards upon which we judged it, it would not have made as much of a splash as it has. What sets this game apart is that it dares to try things you just don't see in other games in terms of narrative, gameplay and mechanics, and most importantly, how they play off of one another. For example, depending on the scenario, you could be playing this game as a spectacle fighter, or as a bullet hell arcade game, or as a spectacle fighter where you dodge bullets the same way you would in an arcade game. Well, you get the idea. In terms of story, it's not just about the story being told with the main characters, but also the exploration around themes of self and purpose, as well as the philosophical ideas and questions surrounding these concepts. This is brought to the forefront right out of the gate, because neither the characters you play as or the enemies you face are human. They are two different kinds of machine lifeforms, both struggling to fulfill the implied wishes of their creators, and those implied wishes are all they have to go on whilst trying to find a purpose for their existence. As someone with a background in philosophy and a great interest in the subject, this really appeals to me, and I would say that I got the most out of this game's narrative as something that got me thinking about other questions and issues. That also ties into how the game uses its medium to further the experience. After you finish the game once, you can re-experience many of the same scenarios from a different perspective, giving you new insights not only into the situation at hand, but also what you did in your first playthrough, something that would flat out not have been possible to do as elegantly in a book or a movie. I won't deny that the B route, as it's called, drags a little bit, but it's still an interesting experience. After that, the game just takes off, leading to some extremely memorable moments due to their sheer brazenness, tragedy, or borderline absurdity. It's one hell of a ride, to say the least. Here is where I was going to talk at length about my experience at the very end of the game, but I'll refrain from doing that. Mainly it's because it would make this entry twice as long as all the other ones, but I also don't want to rob anyone of that experience if they decide to play the game at a later date. All I'll say is that it is a wholly unique moment, and one that is only possible through the medium of video games. It was also one of positivity and camaraderie, something that I felt was very uplifting, especially given the times we live in. To summarize, Nier Automata really is one of a kind, and while it has some glaring flaws, it more than makes up for it by allowing video games as an art form to develop. It might not be the best game on a technical level, but as an exploration of what games can be, as well as being one of the most shining examples of how games can deliver unique experiences that no other mediums can, it might be one of the most important games of the past decade. As Jim Sterling so eloquently put it, if history forgets about this game, then fuck history. Number 4. Pyre. The by far most popular video on my channel is the story summary for Transistor, something I'm really happy about, mainly because it shows that there is still interest in that game. Even though Supergiant games are far from obscure, I still think their games deserve a lot more attention than they currently get, and ever since Transistor, I've been super excited to see what they would do next. Having now played and finished Pyre, I think it's safe to say that they've done it again. Pyre is a weird game to try and describe. It's kind of like a visual novel in its presentation, but kind of like an RPG in terms of progression and character development. Yet the gameplay itself is like a combination of a mystical game of basketball crossed with a tactics game that also includes skill shots, spells, and fast-paced maneuvering. This all sounds quite complicated, but trust me when I say that it really isn't once you get your hands on it. Needless to say, this game well and truly does its own thing, and like all of Supergiant's other games, the execution is damn near flawless. This is definitely the most narrative-heavy game that Supergiant has done to date, and one could make the argument that the way it's presented is a bit of a hurdle. It's mainly static character images and text, along with a few spoken words in a made-up language, save for some characters who speak English. While I've heard some people call this a little stale, I personally don't mind when the writing is this good. The characters are both interesting and fun, so I'm usually curious about what they have to say. There are also some really great character interactions and relationships that develop as the game progresses, so if anything, reading in this game is kind of a treat, provided that it's a style of presentation that you can get behind. The party interaction is also integrated into the game's main quest. You and your group find yourself in the Downside, a place to which criminals of various kinds are banished. There is only one way to escape the Downside, and that is through the rights, the aforementioned mystical basketball. If a team does well, they get the chance to win back their freedom. The twist, however, is that only one teammate can be sent back at a time. This presents you, the player, with some difficult choices. Do you send back the people you think deserve it the most, even if they're one of your star players? Or do you put the team's competitiveness above all else and only send back those who don't contribute all that much? This is the kind of choice I relish in, where you have to get your priorities straight and think about your long-term plan, as well as what you want the outcome of that plan to be. Then there are the other teams. Some of them are just scumbags or downright creepy, but some of them are truly sympathetic, to the point that you don't want to beat them and ruin their shot at freedom. This led to me feeling guilty about winning more than once, something that adds an interesting layer of nuance to the whole narrative and your interactions with the other teams. I do of course also have to bring up the music. The Transistor soundtrack is still an amazing piece of work, but I think these may be Darren Korb's best compositions to date. He once again brings in Ashley Barrett to sing, but this time he also steps up to the mic, and the result is nothing short of magical. The game's main theme, In the Flame, was my most played song on Spotify last year, which I think speaks for itself. I mean, just listen to it. Like the previous games, the soundtrack is one of the main attractions, and is almost worth the asking price alone. While this game does not reach as high as Transistor did on its top 10 list, I would still consider Pyre to be the better game, if only by a slight margin. If you're down for something that is unique, engaging, and incredibly beautiful both in terms of audio and visuals, then Pyre is a must-play. At the end of my Transistor entry on the 2014 list, I said that Supergiant's record remains unblemished, a statement that is as true today as it was back then. Number 3. Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice. Out of all the games I played last year, this is the one that I respect the most, both in terms of subject matter and the circumstances under which it was made. For those unfamiliar with the game's premise, you play as the picked warrior Senua, who journeys to the Norse underworld to bargain with the gods for the soul of her lover, who lost his life when the Northmen invaded their islands. The twist, if you want to call it that, is that Senua suffers from severe psychosis. Were this any other game, this would probably just result in an occasionally blurry screen and some very deliberate hallucinations, but Ninja Theory were a bit more ambitious than that. They worked very closely with a group of people who actually suffer from psychosis and based many of Senua's experiences off of what these collaborators described. Visual distortions create new paths, fear and phobias manifest to create faceless hazards and enemies, such as a sentient fire, and multiple voices in Senua's head shift from encouraging and spurring her on to mocking and degrading her very efforts. The voices are one of my favorite aspects of the whole experience, which is the main reason that I played this game with headphones, even though I played it on the PS4. Every voice comes from a different direction, giving you an eerie sense of paranoia, as well as that of an unwelcome presence within your own thoughts, yet at the same time, they function as a defense during combat, where they will call out incoming attacks from angles you currently can't see. All of this creates an uneasy attitude towards the voices. Sometimes you want to shut them out and ignore them completely, other times you want to listen to them and follow their advice. You never really know what to make of them, whether they could be considered friend or foe, or what they are after at any given time. It's one of the many details that make this game such a special experience, as well as something that greatly contributes to Senua's character and the world she inhabits. Something I also appreciate is that the game doesn't frame Senua's condition as something that needs to be conquered, nor as a superpower. It's a part of who she is, both in times of happiness and sorrow, and it's not all darkness all the time. The game even shows us glimpses from her life where she's doing just fine, as well as some truly beautiful visions. Anyone who claims that the game is about her defeating her condition clearly wasn't paying attention to what her goals were or how this story actually ends. Presentation-wise, the game is disturbingly cohesive. The environment designs are fittingly grim and twisted, the atmosphere and tone oppressive, and the enemies you fight are like hulking demonic versions of their real-life inspirations. Incidentally, that bit served as a bit of a personal mindfuck for me, seeing as these Northmen are, as far back as I can trace my lineage, my ancestors. So it was, if nothing else, really interesting to see them portrayed in such an unflattering light. It was also fascinating to hear the old Norse mythology tales told in the most deranged and gruesome way possible, which is quite the contrast to how they were told to us when we were in elementary school. All of these aspects, from the presentation and tone to your interactions with the world to the amazing performances, especially Melina Jorgens as Senua, makes this one of the most intense yet intriguing games I've ever played. Fun fact about Jorgens, she is a video editor at the studio who was just supposed to be a stand-in while they were testing the motion capture technology, but she did such a good job that at the end of the day, the role of Senua went to her. She even went on to win several industry awards for her performance, so that'll give you an idea of how convincing her performance is. When you also take into account that this game was created and released without the help of a publisher, it's even more impressive how well this all came together. It's obviously not a game for the faint of heart. In fact, I would say that this is one game that thoroughly earns its 18+ age rating, but if you feel that you can handle the themes and how they're presented, this really is a game well worth experiencing for yourself. I guarantee that it will not leave you unaffected. Number 2. Horizon Zero Dawn. There are games that you like, there are games that you really like, and there are games that you love. Every now and again though, there comes a game that you don't just love, you fall in love with it. And over the past year, I have completely fallen in love with Horizon Zero Dawn. This is one of those games that click with me on nearly every level. I love exploring this post-apocalyptic world, discovering new breathtaking vistas, finding relics of the old world, and just taking in the scenery. I love the combat system and how many legitimate strategies there are, both when fighting machines and humans. I especially like fighting the larger machines. It really gives me that wonderful feeling of being something significantly smaller, going toe-to-toe with an enemy that should be able to just crush me. I also enjoy utilizing some of the more spectacular weapon combos, like freezing a Thunderjaw and then pelting it with explosives. The combat system never grew dull for me either, but that might be because I'm a sucker for games where bows are the primary weapons. I also truly loved the story told in this game. Going in, I thought I had a pretty good idea about what had happened to the world and how humanity found itself living in tribes again, but without giving anything away, I was way off! The plot Guerrilla came up with was far more interesting and complex than any of the scenarios I was expecting, so to sit there and marvel at the various twists and revelations was nothing short of a treat. The excellent writing also extends to the main characters, who are all both well developed and presented in an interesting way. Some of them also have backstories that could have been entire games in and of themselves, and once you finally get to know what makes, or made, a character tick, you learn to appreciate them even more. At the center of it all is Aloy, and I don't really have anything to add other than to say that she's now easily one of my favorite main characters of any game. I like her design, I like her attitude, I like her backstory, and I like the way she handles. Credit also has to go to Ashley Burch for an amazing voiceover performance. I thought Chloe Price from Life is Strange was the perfect part for her, but that title has now been thoroughly claimed by Aloy. The real star of the show though, as previously mentioned, is the world itself. It manages to be beautiful, sad, upbeat, and terrifying all at the same time without any of the elements feeling like it clashes with another. I just loved inhabiting this place and would use any excuse I could to just get out there. If I was low in a resource, I would go out and hunt machines for it instead of just buying it, even though I had more than enough money to do so. Sometimes I would not use the fast travel system when I need to go somewhere, because I just wanted to soak up the atmosphere. I just really liked being there and would use any excuse I could find to remain there for as long as I could. I almost accidentally got the Platinum Trophy just by exploring and playing. There was just one trophy that I had to go out of my way to get. The rest just came naturally as I tried to squeeze every drop I could out of this game. And even now, having done everything there is to do in it, I still have the urge to go back and replay it. That, if anything, should give you an idea of how much I enjoyed it. This game made a serious run at the number 1 spot on this list, and for the majority of the year I kept going back and forth between this and what would eventually end up at number 1. Had Horizon come out in any of the past 5 years, say for 2015, The Witcher 3 is still one of my favorite games of all time, it would probably have snatched the number 1 spot on any given year. The fact that it only reaches number 2 in 2017 really gives you an idea of how amazing of a year in gaming it truly was. At the end of the day though, there can only be one game of the year, and there was one that was able to surpass even Horizon. Before we get to the very top though, a few honorable mentions to games that I played and enjoyed in 2017, but didn't quite make it onto the list. Gravity Rush 2. This was the last game to get cut from the list, and it's a game I truly adore. Primarily it's because it's such a step up from Gravity Rush 1, but also because it takes everything about itself and cranks it up to 11. The locations, the story, the bosses, it all goes for it so goddamn hard that I have no choice but to be impressed. Like the final boss at the end of Chapter 2 for example, explaining it and how it comes about is so bizarre that I'm not sure you'd believe me even if I tried. I wanted this game on the list, I really did, but dated mission design, frustrating new mechanics that keeps getting introduced for single missions, and a camera that just can't keep up with the moves they expect you to pull keeps it just outside of the top 10. Consider it an unofficial number 11, I suppose. Batman: The Enemy Within. This, along with the first Batman game, proves that Telltale still knows how to crank out great games, especially after the blunder that was Game of Thrones. I will also give this game credit for having one of the most interesting takes on the Joker I've seen in a while. I'm on pins and needles to see how this season ends, and that's the way I like it with episodic games, where the format can add to the suspense. XCOM 2: War of the Chosen. A great expansion that adds some fantastic new elements to an already good game. The titular Chosen are by far the best addition, giving you worthy opponents that hound you throughout your campaign, always showing up when you least need them to throw off whatever strategy you had in mind. I also really liked the new faction soldiers you can recruit, though I maintain that the main draw is still naming regular soldiers after your friends and family, and then see what shenanigans they get up to. The main knock I have against this expansion is that once the Chosen have been cleared out, it's pretty much still the same campaign we played 2 years ago. Assassin's Creed Origins. I've yet to finish this game, and if I tried to do so before getting this list out, I think I'd have to delay it until May. There are so many things to do and so many places to visit in this game, and I want to give it a fair shake and not have to rush through it. From what I've played so far though, I really like it, both in terms of gameplay and the characters. I'm still a little too early to give a verdict on the story, but overall, it's a solid Assassin's Creed game. Metroid: Samus Returns. I'm a massive Metroid fan. Super Metroid was my all-time favorite game for many years until it was trumped back in 2010, so when I heard that they were making this, I jumped on that shit like a 5-year-old on a bouncy castle. It was a really solid game and it scratched that long dormant Metroid itch, and I'm so happy that it seems that this franchise finally has a future with Metroid Prime 4 and hopefully new 2D titles as well. Also, that final reveal you get after getting 100% of the items, that was really cool and also unexpectedly creepy. And finally, the infectious madness of Dr. Decker. This game is weird. It's kind of wonderful, but weird. Really weird. It's a format well suited to the FMV presentation, and the actors do a wonderful job in portraying their characters with their many quirks. It is a little frustrating to go word hunting when trying to find a particular response, but I'd still recommend it if you're into games that are a little mindfucking. Also, check out Dodgers and Jesse Cox's playthrough of this game. That is quite something. While 2017 goes on record as one of the best years in gaming, it goes without saying that a title like that doesn't exempt it from having a few duds. I'm not going to talk about the outright worst games of the year, but rather one that ultimately broke my heart. First though, an honorable mention, or dishonorable mention if you will, to a game that didn't quite hit the mark for me. And that would be Wolfenstein 2: The New Colossus. It's not a bad game by any stretch, I just wish it could make up its mind about what kind of game it wants to be. If you want to be a stealth game, give me some tools so I can actually play the game like that. If you want to be an action game, then make the main character a little more durable than tissue paper in a hailstorm. Again, it's not bad and I don't regret playing it. What I do regret is paying full price for it. For the most disappointing game of the year though, remember how I said that Super Metroid was my favorite game of all time until 2010? Early that year, it was supplanted by the game that I to this day hold up as the best video game experience I've ever had. That would be Mass Effect 2. With that said, I think it's fairly obvious what the most disappointing game I played in 2017 was. Mass Effect Andromeda. I should add that it isn't just Mass Effect 2 that I hold in high regards, it's the entire Mass Effect series. See this? This is a picture of the 5-year anniversary print that I bought back in 2012. I've had it framed and hanging on my wall ever since. I wrote my bachelor's essay on how the moral ambiguity of the games was represented in the novelizations. I bought a 360 just to play the first game, and I bought the collector's edition for 2 and 3 on the day they came out. I love this series to bits, and the games have been some of the most fundamental building blocks informing my tastes and preferences for modern games. And then came Andromeda. I'll state up front that I don't think Andromeda is a terrible game. I picked it up for like $20 on an autumn sale long after the various patches had been rolled out, so I never suffered through the worst bugs, the dopiest face animations, and the most horrendous crashes. My playthrough went relatively smoothly on a technical level, and I think the combat is actually pretty good, so my disappointment with the game does not stem from the gameplay itself. It's everything else that made Mass Effect what it was, and as a game set in one of the greatest video game universes ever put on paper, and as the follow-up to my favorite games of all time, it falls woefully short. The setup for the game is alright, but very little comes of it, and even less is done to differentiate it from the setting of the first 3 games. The Nexus is basically the Citadel, the Tempest is basically the Normandy, the Andromeda Project heads are basically the Council, and so on. For what's supposed to be a whole different galaxy full of possibilities, there is so little willingness to step away from established concepts. I wanted to see things evolve, have the new setting be a jumping off point to expand the Mass Effect universe, but what we got instead was the equivalent of someone trying to step out of their comfort zone by putting one toe outside of it before scurrying back into a corner, too afraid to abandon what they consider safe. Then there are the party members, the glue that usually holds together the whole narrative arc in any BioWare game. Here, there are 1 or 2 that I would consider decent, the rest are just kinda bland, and 2 that flat out suck. Those 2 would be Liam and PB. They're not assets to the team, they're a liability. Liam is reckless to the point that he should get kicked off the ship and grounded, plus his loyalty mission is just fucking terrible in every sense of the word. PB, on the other hand, flat out tricks you and almost gets you and another party member killed. Now that's the kind of people I want watching my back, people who are unreliable and willing to play fast and loose with my life. In previous games there have been characters that I haven't really clicked with, but none that I flat out resented like this. Add to that the fact that everyone is written like a jokey-joke laid-back cool dude, as in no one seems to take the task at hand particularly seriously, and you have a crew that I didn't want to spend more time with than was necessary, and that's a first for me in a BioWare game. I could go on for hours about my feelings on this game, but the bottom line is that while this is an okay game as a space shooter, as a Mass Effect game it doesn't even come close to living up to expectations. I feel for the people who made this game. It seems they got screwed at pretty much every turn, and I'm sure they would have been able to deliver something way better if they'd been given a fair shot. Even so, I can't look past the fact that the end product may have killed the whole franchise, seeing as it's been put on ice until further notice. With all of this in mind, there is no way I could not classify Mass Effect Andromeda as my most disappointing game of 2017. I hope we get to see you again, Mass Effect. I really, really do. Sorry if that went on a little long, but I really needed to get that out of my system. Now, with all that gloomy business taken care of, let's now turn our gaze to the game that was, in my opinion, the creme de la creme of this wonderful year in gaming. Number 1. Persona 5. There were a ton of games to look forward to last year, but for me, this was the big one. I played Persona 4 back in 2013, and I got hooked something fierce. I blasted my way through it and enjoyed every second of it, making it my favorite PS2 game and one of my favorite games of all time. I jumped into Persona 3 right after that and enjoyed the hell out of that one too, though not quite to the same extent as 4. Later that year, the first teaser for Persona 5 dropped. I usually don't get super hyped for games anymore, been burned one too many times, but this one really got me going, but of course it also had me concerned. Just how do you follow up on a masterpiece like Persona 4? Come my birthday in April, I had my answer. I feel like I have to do a very brief rundown on what these games are about for the uninitiated. The Persona games are about teenagers who usually travel to some kind of parallel dimension to fight supernatural creatures. A premise that sounds really out there at first glance, but when you actually play the game, it feels surprisingly grounded and logical in context, as odd as that may sound. The gameplay is split between dungeon crawling in the other dimension and living life as a high school student. In the dungeons you explore, fight enemies, hunt for loot and defeat bosses. As a student you go to class, study, hang out with your friends, develop your various attributes and look for things to give you an edge in the dungeons. Everything ties back to the goal of developing your personas, the various creatures and entities you call upon to aid you in battle, whose existence is usually tied to the main narrative. Persona 5 builds on the core ideas that made Persona 4 so appealing and takes them in a new, and in my opinion, appropriate direction. The setting moves from the countryside to Tokyo, opening up many more venues for interactions and exploration. The protagonist is still a newcomer at his school, but this time he's been branded as a hooligan for a crime he didn't commit, making life all the more difficult for him. The dungeons, or palaces as they're called here, are once again based on people's desires, but this time they're molded by the fantasies of some truly vile people and how they perceive themselves in the world. For example, the first palace is based on a repugnant teacher who sees himself as the king of the school where he works, so the palace becomes a giant castle. The game's first antagonist may be one of the most punchable people I've ever encountered in any game, giving you all the motivation you need to take him on. This also ties into the game's main objective, wherein you have to infiltrate the palaces of various criminals and, as the game puts it, steal their hearts to make them confess all their crimes. While there is a lot more going on in the story than that, you're given more than enough reason to embrace your role as the leader of the Phantom Thieves, as the game's core group decide to name themselves. If you couldn't already tell, I really like the story in this game. While it doesn't have the allure of a murder mystery like 4 did, it still tackles some interesting themes and subjects, mainly surrounding the concepts of groupthink and the nature of cruelty. I've heard some people say that the cast of characters isn't as strong as the one in 4, but I still think they work great and I truly enjoyed spending time with them. As a complete opposite to Mass Effect Andromeda, I honestly felt sad when this game was over, because I wanted to keep hanging out with these characters. Thankfully though, their story ends in a very satisfying way. Overall, it's a narrative and a world you'll love getting lost in, even if there are some less than elegant exposition dumps and one particular character arc that I'm not entirely on board with. In the grand scheme of things though, those are just nitpicks. If we move to the game's presentation, I would say that it's so damn sharp that I'm not sure we have a word to properly describe it. Just look at the interface and the menu in the footage. This style permeates the entire game and never lets up. If Persona 4 was slick, then this is on a whole other level. The graphics aren't super fancy, but what they do is complement the style and work really well with the locations you visit, especially the dungeons. The soundtrack is one of the game's absolute highlights and maintains the very high standard set by its predecessors. I don't think I can do it justice by talking about it, I'm just gonna play you some of my favorite bits. I could just keep going about things to love in this game. The character designs, how much fun the combat system is, how enjoyable it is to build your relationships, the amazing environment design, the places the story goes, the arcs some characters go through, the wide range of things you can do in your spare time, the magnificence of the ending. I could easily go on. At the end of the day though, all I can say is that this is an amazing video game. A game that provided me with just the kind of experience I'm hoping I'll get whenever I pop a new disc into the system. It was a long journey that still felt way too short, and I don't think there's anything more telling than a game that took around 100 hours to complete, leaving you with a feeling of wanting more. That's the kind of game you only run into on special occasions, and that's why Persona 5 is my favorite game of 2017. This was the kind of year we only see like once in a decade. But it sure as hell was a good time to be a video game fan in 2017. 2018 has some big shoes to fill, and I fear it may struggle to do so. But I still hope it will be a good year for gaming, and a good year for all of you. Yeah, that probably should have been said about 2 months ago, but as usual in life, things happen. Work, social life, mom having surgery done on her feet and needing some assistance back home. Yeah, this really hasn't been the best time for video work. Even so, I hope you enjoyed it, even if it was a little late. And as usual, there is always a video in the pipeline, even if it takes a little while to get out. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other. I'll see you then.
You never see it coming.